So we've talked about the causes of the American Revolution and how there were different reasons for the common person to support a revolutionary effort and different reasons for people who wanted to step up and be leaders of that movement. And the start of this presentation actually is those causes that led to a larger swath of the population being willing to entertain a revolutionary cause. And we already went over in our last presentation the Enlightenment, which is what made those usually upper class folks want to lead this revolutionary cause. So you can see the first cause being the Proclamation of 1763. This is going to make angry the lower class because they want access to land. This proclamation at the end of the French and Indian War said that colonists could not settle any further west than the Appalachian Mountains. Without that additional land to settle, lower class people were going to have a hard time moving up in society, having any social mobility. The second cause, nobody likes paying taxes, so yeah, there were plenty of lower class people that disliked paying taxes, but this was more troublesome to the upper class because this was cutting into their profits. John Hancock was a wealthy merchant in Boston who was actually quite loyal to the British Crown until taxes started cutting into his profits. Then he started cooperating with really radical people like Sam Adams to lead a revolutionary effort against the British. So the first cause tends to affect the lower class more and affect their opinion more. The second cause tends to have much more to do with the upper class. Although taxes do affect everyone, the upper class were much more concerned with this second issue. So in 1765, 2 years after the end of the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act required all sorts of printed materials, anything that would be considered a paper product, like newspapers, books, court documents, etc., had to have a stamp from British governmental authorities. And even everyday things like playing cards had a tax put on them. This is the first direct tax on the colonies after the French and Indian War. It affected nearly every social class in some way, shape, or form, and is universally unpopular, regardless of whether you're upper or lower class. In opposing the Stamp Act, some colonists, including Benjamin Franklin, obviously well-known historical figure, seemed to make the suggestion that if Britain raised revenue by regulating trade rather than direct taxation, that might be more acceptable to the people. However, this is only true if you can evade those taxes. I mentioned previously John Hancock, a famous Boston merchant, very, very wealthy man, and he was perfectly fine with taxes on trade as long as he had an easy time avoiding paying them. And so the Townshend Acts get their name from the chief financial officer of the Crown, Charles Townshend, and he instituted all these new taxes and rules on the Board of Customs in mainly Boston, and things get heated again. And people like John Hancock are desperately trying to evade the taxes, but they end up with their cargo getting seized by the British government, and a lot of that is what leads loyal British citizens like John Hancock to seek alternatives, such as cooperating with radicals like Sam Adams. In 1770, very famous incident, the Boston Massacre, and you can see here the engraving done by Paul Revere to depict it as exactly that, a massacre. British soldiers shooting into an innocent and unarmed crowd. Now, the reality of the story is that this is a mob that had gotten out of control. They were throwing snowballs and ice chunks and even rocks at these soldiers, and somewhere in the crowd, nobody really knows whether this was from a British soldier, from one of the citizens trying to incite a problem here. Somebody yells fire, and these troops fire into the crowd. And so the soldiers are accused of murdering people. John Adams, who actually ends up one of the revolutionary figures leading the revolutionary effort, actually defends the British soldiers. He believed very strongly in the right to a defense. And so quality legal representation, even in the face of negative public opinion, is something that we believe strongly in as Americans. Everybody deserves a good defense at trial. And this dates all the way back to John Adams defending the British soldiers accused of murder at the Boston Massacre. A few years later, you have the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party as a result. The Tea Act provided the British East India Company with tax benefits that it would allow them to sell their overstocked tea at very low prices. So this was not a direct tax. It's often a misconception that this was a tax on tea. And the Tea Act, in fact, was not a tax as much as it was giving the British government-controlled East India Company a leg up. And so people who were merchants or maybe even illegal smugglers, their tea they couldn't sell without selling at a loss. And so the British East India Company is undercutting their prices and obviously their profits. And so in December of 1773, specifically the 16th, the Boston Tea Party took place. A bunch of the Sons of Liberty boarded ships and threw cases upon cases upon cases of tea into Boston Harbor as an act of protest. And in response, British Parliament passes the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts do a series of things that are very specifically targeted at the city of Boston in particular. First, it closed the port of Boston. No more trade in and out until the tea was fully paid for. It eliminated the Massachusetts Charter, which shaped the Massachusetts Bay Colony's government, and made all positions that were once elected by the people to be appointed by the colonial governor or the crown itself. It allowed any royal official to be removed to England for trial for any crimes committed in the colonies. This sounds a whole lot like if something else like the Boston Massacre happens, then we're going to pull those soldiers out and try them back in Britain. That doesn't sound very fair to the colonists when it's announced. And the last piece here, that troops could now be quartered in the homes of colonists. This, right here, ends up leading to the Third Amendment to the Constitution in the Bill of Rights in 1791 because of what an unpopular thing that was. So in response, a lot of the colonial leaders that dislike the Intolerable Acts and have already had some disagreements with the British Crown, they convene the First Continental Congress. Representatives from 12 different colonies attend. Georgia did not attend. Georgia was very, very loyal to the crown. And 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives. And the goal really was, let's talk about ways that we can appeal to the British government to treat us more respectfully. But also we need to listen to their concerns as well. We can't act as though we didn't bear some responsibility for the way things have been going. In 1774, in response to the Intolerable Acts, you had a lot of protests, sometimes violent, and the exciseman, this painting is called Bostonians Paying the Exciseman. The exciseman is the tax collector. And Bostonians paying the exciseman, what they're actually doing is tarring and feathering him and pouring boiling hot tea down his throat. And that doesn't sound like much, but if you think about having just burned your mouth on something that's a little too hot, imagine having boiling hot tea forced all the way down your gullet and into your stomach and how painful that is. Then imagine having hot tar put on your skin, which immediately blisters your skin, and then feathers thrown on you so that when you try to pick the feathers off, it peels layers of flesh off of your body. So a rather torturous experience, and tarring and feathering is depicted here in this famous painting. Now, despite the efforts of the First Continental Congress to want to negotiate with the Crown, what eventually happens is the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the 19th of April to be more specific. So British General Thomas Gage, who is not only in charge of all British troops, but has also been appointed colonial governor to replace another man who was believed to be too soft and had failed the crown in controlling particularly Boston, but Massachusetts in general. And he heard that there were weapons being stockpiled by Samuel Adams, funded by the wealthy John Hancock. And when he gets word of this, he immediately issues orders to his troops to march on Concord and seize the weapons. Now, Paul Revere hears of this through the rebel spy network. Now, as the story goes, Thomas Gage's own wife was having an affair with a colonial member of society, Dr. Joseph Warren. And Joseph Warren was a part of this rebel spy network with Paul Revere and the others. He passes word, rumor has it, that it was Gage's wife herself that did this. There's no definitive evidence of this, but a lot of suggestive evidence. He informs Paul Revere. Paul Revere goes to his friend William Dawes, and the two of them ride out into the countryside to warn that the regulars were coming. Now, the story goes, and Longfellow's poem about Paul Revere's ride says, "The British are coming, the British are coming." Well, nobody would have said that because everybody at this time considered themselves British. Even Paul Revere and William Dawes. They believed to be abused British citizens, but nonetheless they considered themselves British citizens. So when they were riding through the countryside, they were not shouting, "The British are coming," they were shouting, "The regulars are coming," or "The redcoats are coming." So there are skirmishes in both Lexington, where it is believed that Sam Adams and John Hancock are hiding out, and then Concord, where it is believed that the colonial militias are stockpiling weapons. The British start to retreat. They actually get turned back at Concord. Lexington is a resounding British victory. Concord, the British get turned back because everybody, after hearing about Lexington, starts gathering all of the area militias and going to Concord. And so the British are actually outnumbered by the time they get there. As they retreat and try to march back to Boston, the British are absolutely dumbfounded by guerrilla attacks from the side of the road, from behind fences, from the woods. From the British perspective, this is very ungentlemanly of the colonist. In this time period, the gentlemanly way to make war is to meet your opponent in a field, line up in ranks, march at each other while pausing to fire, and whoever retreats first loses. Guerrilla attacks, the colonists had learned from their service in the French and Indian War. The Native American allies of both the British and the French used these guerrilla attacks against the colonists and with them against their enemies during the French and Indian War, so these colonists are now using them against the British. It is the first shot fired at Lexington Green that is thought to have officially started the American Revolution. So this comes to be known as the shot heard round the world. A painting here depicts the skirmish at Lexington. You can see the ragtag colonial militia and the well-organized ranks of the British. And it was Captain John Parker, who has a statue dedicated to him in Lexington today, as the commanding officer on the field with the colonial militia, is quoted as having said, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." So they knew darn well they were not going to be able to defeat the British or even resist them all that well, but they wanted to make a statement that we are no longer going to take the abuses of your government lying down. We are going to stand up to you. And after the success of turning the British back at Concord, and then the guerrilla attacks all the way back to Boston, there's some confidence, actually, in a possible colonial war effort. You then have the convening of the Second Continental Congress. The mood is very different. Instead of a negotiating mood, let's try to plead with the crown. The Second Continental Congress, there are a lot of angry feelings. Despite these feelings, cooler heads attempted to prevail by convincing the members at this second gathering to issue the Olive Branch Petition. Now, the Olive Branch goes back to biblical times, and to offer an olive branch means let's put the past behind us, let's not dislike each other anymore. And this is sent to the king, but the king won't even look at it. He says, issue a proclamation of rebellion, and we're going to put these people down by force. He wanted to make an example of Bostonians and hopefully teach the rest of the colonies, because there's a reasonable amount of unrest in other colonies as well, that this is what happens to you. So he's sending more troops to put this down by force. Thinkers like Thomas Paine, very much in love with Enlightenment thought and natural rights of man. He argues that the Lockean thoughts of a constitutional monarchy that could be limited by checks on crown authority is inadequate. Think about that. John Locke's ideas are radical, and Thomas Paine says, nope, not nearly radical enough, because I don't even think a monarchy in any way, shape, or form is acceptable. He wants more specific limitations by a Republican Constitution, which is what we now have in the United States. Paine also says why the British Empire has only hurt the American colonies and how independence would allow America to prosper more than anyone could imagine under British control. And this famous work is published entitled Common Sense. He writes this all down. Now, even Thomas Paine had his misgivings about a revolutionary effort until the battles of Lexington and Concord. And then he thinks that's it. We're past the point of no return now. This is war. So after Common Sense, after more convening of the Second Continental Congress, after the rejection of the Olive Branch Petition, you have the Declaration of Independence. In between Lexington and Concord, in between the meeting of the Second Continental Congress in May, there is another major battle in June. And in June of 1775, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which the British take immeasurable numbers of casualties, just massive casualties, marching on a heavily fortified colonial position in a hill outside of Boston. It was actually Breed's Hill. It comes to be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was nearby. Even more convinced that they are past the point of no return, the Second Continental Congress agree unanimously on the Declaration of Independence. This declares things that we now know as famous phrases like, all men are created equal, and that they have certain natural rights, or as they're worded in the Declaration by Thomas Jefferson, inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember, in yesterday's Enlightenment presentation, I told you about John Locke's views of life, liberty, and property. Well, the Founding Fathers, as they helped draft the Declaration, did not want it to seem as though there was going to be no social mobility, that only people who had property and wealth could enjoy liberty. So they changed that terminology to the pursuit of happiness, and that would allow for social mobility and what we now know of as the American dream. It states all of the reasons why the Crown has screwed up. First, generically, they say unjust governments can and should be overthrown by their people. And the remaining body of the document goes from those generics to a list of very specific grievances against the Crown that have gone unaddressed or ignored. And on July 4th, 1776, this is made official. It is voted on July 2nd. It is not formally signed until July 4th. So then you have the American Revolution. And unfortunately, as fascinating as the history of the Revolution is, the New York State curriculum doesn't really call for a very deep study of the Revolution itself. It wants you to learn about the lead up to it. It does want you to know a basic overview of the Revolution. And then it wants you to deal with the aftermath, like how do you form a new nation after winning the Revolution. So I'll give you a brief overview of the Revolution, as much as it pains me, because like I said, this is a very, very fascinating time period. So you have the battles of Lexington and Concord, and then the Declaration of Independence. We've already discussed these in great detail. But in the fall of 1776, after the Declaration, the British, after needing to retreat from Boston because of Washington's forces threatening them there, they land in New York, and it is like the Death Star in Star Wars. Here comes the Empire after the rebels. And Washington is literally running for his life with his army, getting slaughtered in battle after battle after battle in New York and Long Island. And by the wintertime, he is quite literally on the run. And the British are very confident that they are nipping this revolution in the bud. But Washington makes a desperate move. He crosses the Delaware River on Christmas in 1776, and he attacks Trenton. And Trenton has been heavily occupied and fortified by German mercenary troops, so paid troops known as Hessians. Consider them like the Navy SEALs of the time. The British military was the strongest in the world because of resources, manpower, but when it came to individual soldiers, the most impressive in the world were these Hessian mercenaries. And catching them by surprise, Washington actually gets a resounding victory at Trenton, and it breathes new life into the revolutionary cause. And it is this that is one of the things that keeps that cause alive, almost immediately followed up by the Battle of Princeton, another surprise attack and surprise victory by Washington and his army. This keeps the struggle alive, and it attracts more troops to the cause. He was losing troops when he was getting his butt kicked in New York. He was gaining troops after he had won in Trenton and Princeton. Then in the fall of 1777, you have the Battle of Saratoga. Now, there's a lot of really cool details that go into this, but essentially, the British were trying to come down from the Adirondacks to the east from the west through the Mohawk Valley and up the Hudson Valley with 3 different armies to converge on Albany and seize Albany. And hopefully by controlling Lake Champlain and the entire Hudson Valley, they would cut the colonies in two. At Saratoga, however, one of those main armies is surrounded and has to surrender to one of Washington's subordinate generals, General Gates. And this is considered the turning point of the war, because the French come in on the side of the Americans and provide resources and, most importantly, naval power. The Continental Army did not really have a navy to support it, and now, with French help, there would be naval support. Now, from 1777 to 1781, there is 4 years' worth of live to fight another day. We're going to fight when it favors us. We're going to fight when we think we have a chance to win. But we're going to run and hide when we think we might lose. And for 4 years, it's just lots of sneak attacks, surprise attacks, and retreating when the numbers did not favor the Continental Army. Finally, in the fall of 1781, the Battle of Yorktown is what we could refer to historically as the straw that broke the camel's back. Meaning, the people back in Britain, the common citizen, look to the crown, the government in general, and say, let the colonies go. This is no longer worth the financial investment. This is no longer worth the cost in human life. Let them go. So in the summer and fall of 1783, the Treaty of Paris is negotiated, and the war is officially over, and you have the birth of a new nation, the United States. Before ending the presentation, I want you to look at this famous painting of Washington crosses the Delaware. You should notice that it was not painted until 1851. So this is not somebody with first-hand knowledge of the Battle of Trenton. So it's not surprising that he gets some of the details wrong. First of all, nobody, particularly the commanding general, is going to be standing up in a boat crossing the Delaware in December. There's ice chunks in the water, the current is treacherous, and you could be thrown overboard if you were standing up. The man behind him so patriotically holding up the flag, that wouldn't be happening either. But nonetheless, it comes to be known as one of the most famous paintings in all of American history. And probably one of the most famous quotes, one of the quotes that was used to inspire the troops before the battle. Thomas Paine, the same author of Common Sense, writes American Crisis. He sees that the revolutionary effort is on its back. It's against the ropes. It's about ready to be finished off. And he wants to inspire troops to fight on. And one of the most famous quotes from American Crisis reads, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." So Thomas Paine is saying, all the wusses have gone. Those that are left are the bravest of the brave, and we love you for what you're doing. And this gave some inspiration for the actual crossing of the Delaware, and obviously to reinvigorate the cause, to turn the tide at Saratoga a year later, and to win the war and establish the United States of America. That concludes the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out or ask in class, and I will see you in class.